This Greek king cheated death, not once, not twice, but 3 times. He imprisoned the literal god of death, made Hades himself look like a fool, and became the most hated mortal in all of Greek mythology. But the gods made sure he'd pay for it forever. His punishment? So brutal, so perfect. His name became synonymous with endless suffering. This is the story of Sisyphus. Our story begins in ancient Corinth, one of the wealthiest city-states in all of Greece, and ruling over it was a king named Sisyphus, a man whose intelligence was matched only by his arrogance. While other kings relied on armies, Sisyphus relied on his cunning mind. But here's the thing, Sisyphus wasn't just clever, he was ruthless. He murdered travelers who came through his kingdom, stealing their golden possessions. He violated sacred guest friendship laws that the gods themselves had established. And he didn't care, because in his mind, he was smarter than everyone, including the gods. Zeus, king of the gods, was watching. And Zeus had a secret. He'd been sneaking around with a river nymph named Aegina, daughter of the river god Asopus. When Aegina disappeared, her father searched everywhere for her. And guess who saw Zeus carrying her away? That's right, Sisyphus. When Asopus came begging for information, Sisyphus saw an opportunity. "I'll tell you where your daughter is," he said, "but first you need to give my city a fresh water spring." Asopus, desperate and grieving, agreed immediately. Sisyphus got his spring, solving Corinth's water problems forever. Then he ratted out Zeus without a second thought. Zeus took her to an island. He revealed, "He's probably with her right now." Sisyphus rushed off to confront the king of the gods. Now imagine you're Zeus, you're the god, the most powerful being in existence. And some mortal king just exposed your secret affair and made you look foolish. Zeus was absolutely furious. Nobody, and I mean nobody, embarrassed Zeus and lived to tell about it. Zeus sent Thanatos, the literal personification of death itself, to collect Sisyphus. When Thanatos arrived at the palace that night, his instructions were clear. Take Sisyphus's soul to the underworld. No negotiation, no mercy, just death. But here's where Sisyphus proved he wasn't just smart, he was dangerously clever. When death arrived at his door, Sisyphus didn't run, he didn't beg. Instead, he smiled and invited Thanatos inside, because Sisyphus had a plan. "Before you take me," Sisyphus said, "can you show me how these chains work? Zeus wants to make sure I'm properly bound for the underworld." And Thanatos, perhaps flattered by the question, or maybe just not used to mortals cooperating, agreed to demonstrate. The moment Thanatos put those chains on himself, Sisyphus locked them tight. Death itself was now imprisoned, and here's where things got absolutely crazy. Because death wasn't just bound, death had stopped working entirely. Throughout the entire world, nothing could die. Warriors fought in battles and couldn't die from their wounds. The sick and elderly suffered endlessly with no release. Even animals couldn't die. The natural order of the universe had completely broken down, and Sisyphus, he was living his best life, laughing at the gods from his palace. The gods began to panic. Ares, the god of war, was especially angry. What's the point of war if nobody dies? The underworld was empty. No new souls were arriving. Hades, god of the dead, was losing his mind watching his realm become a ghost town. Zeus finally realized the magnitude of the disaster. He called an emergency council of the gods. "Someone has imprisoned Thanatos," he declared. And when they discovered it was Sisyphus, the same mortal who'd embarrassed Zeus earlier, the king of gods was ready to unleash absolute destruction. Ares himself volunteered to fix this. The god of war stormed down to Corinth, smashed his way into the palace, and demanded Thanatos' release. Even Sisyphus knew he couldn't fight a god. He had no choice but to free death from his chains. Thanatos was finally free and absolutely furious. You'd think this was the end of Sisyphus' story, right? Death would finally claim him, take him to the underworld, and that would be that. But Sisyphus had one more trick up his sleeve. Before Ares arrived, Sisyphus had given his wife Merope very specific instructions. "When I die," he told her, "do not give me a proper burial. Don't perform the funeral rites. Don't make any offerings to the gods. Just throw my body in the public square." So when Thanatos finally dragged Sisyphus' soul to the underworld, crossing the river Styx into Hades' realm, Sisyphus put on the performance of his afterlife. He went straight to Persephone, queen of the underworld, with the most pitiful story you've ever heard. "My queen," he cried, "my wife has dishonored me. She threw my body in the street like garbage. She performed no rites, made no offerings. I'm a king. I deserve proper burial." He begged her, "Please, let me return to the living world just for 3 days to punish my wife and ensure I get a proper funeral. Then I'll come right back, I promise." Persephone, moved by his apparent devotion and outrage, gave him permission, and just like that, Sisyphus returned to the land of the living. His soul re-entered his body. He took a deep breath of fresh air, and then he just kept on living. 3 days passed, then 3 weeks, then 3 months. Sisyphus had no intention of returning to the underworld. He'd cheated death for the second time. He lived for years after that, growing old with his wife ruling Corinth, probably laughing every single day about how he'd fooled the gods twice. Meanwhile, in the underworld, Hades finally realized he'd been conned. The king of the dead, the god who ruled over all deceased souls, had been completely played by a mortal. His rage was legendary. Even Persephone stayed away from him for weeks. Eventually Sisyphus did die. Naturally of old age, he'd lived a full, long life after escaping death twice. You'd think he'd be satisfied, right? He'd gotten away with more than any mortal in history. But the gods had been waiting. The moment Sisyphus's soul returned to the underworld, there was no trial, no discussion, no appeal. Thanatos himself personally escorted him deep into Tartarus, the darkest, deepest pit of the underworld reserved for the worst offenders against the gods. Zeus, Hades, Athena, all the major gods gathered to decide his fate. They needed a punishment that matched his crimes, something that would last forever, something that would torture his greatest strength, his clever, cunning mind. And they came up with something absolutely perfect. A boulder. Not just any boulder. An enormous, impossibly heavy boulder of solid stone, and a mountain, steep, treacherous, seemingly endless. Sisyphus's task was simple. Push the boulder to the top of the mountain. That's it. Sounds manageable, right? Here's the twist. At first, Sisyphus pushed with all his strength. Every muscle in his body screamed. Every inch forward felt like a victory. The boulder was enchanted, impossibly heavy, requiring his absolute maximum effort. But Sisyphus was clever. He found the best angles. He used leverage. He conserved his energy. Hours passed, then days. Sisyphus pushed and pushed, making slow but steady progress up the mountain. He could see the summit getting closer. For the first time since entering the underworld, he felt something like hope. Maybe this punishment would end. Maybe he'd reach the top and finally be done. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of pushing, Sisyphus reached the summit. The peak was right there, just one more push, one more surge of strength. He gathered every ounce of energy left in his soul and shoved with everything he had. The boulder touched the summit, and then something terrible happened. The enchantment activated. The boulder became impossibly heavy, heavier than physics should allow. Sisyphus felt it slip. He tried to hold on. He tried with everything he had, but it was useless. The boulder rolled backwards, slowly at first, then faster and faster and faster. It tumbled down the mountain, crashing and bouncing, until it came to rest at the very bottom where he'd started. Hours of work, days of agonizing effort, completely undone in seconds. And here's the truly cruel part. Sisyphus understood immediately. This wasn't a task with an end. This was forever. He would push the boulder up, it would roll down, he would push it up again, and again, and again, for all eternity. His punishment was meaningless effort without end. So Sisyphus went back down. He put his hands on the boulder, and he pushed. Because what else could he do? There was no escape, no trick, no clever plan. The gods had finally found a punishment that his intelligence couldn't solve. Eternal, meaningless labor. Think about that for a moment. Not years, not centuries, not even millennia, forever. Sisyphus is still down there right now, in this very moment, pushing that boulder up that mountain. He'll be pushing it tomorrow, and next year, and 1,000 years from now, without rest, without hope, without end. The ancient Greeks were so disturbed by this story that Sisyphus became their symbol for pointless, endless struggle. His name literally became the word Sisyphean, meaning a task that's impossible and never-ending. Philosophers for thousands of years have debated what this punishment really means. Here's where it gets really interesting. Some philosophers argue that we're all Sisyphus. Think about it. You wake up, go to work, come home, sleep, and do it all again tomorrow. You clean your house knowing it'll get dirty again. You eat knowing you'll be hungry again. Isn't that the same Boulder? But philosopher Albert Camus had a different take. He said we must imagine Sisyphus happy. Why? Because even though the task is meaningless, Sisyphus still chooses to push. The struggle itself, the act of pushing despite knowing the outcome, that's where meaning comes from, not the destination, but the journey. Maybe the real punishment wasn't the boulder at all. Maybe it was that Sisyphus, the clever king who always had a plan, always had an angle, finally had to face something his intelligence couldn't solve. He couldn't trick his way out. He couldn't cheat. He could only endure. And maybe that's the lesson the gods wanted to teach. Sisyphus thought he was smarter than everyone, smarter than mortals, smarter than gods, smarter than death itself. His punishment forced him to confront the truth. Sometimes there is no clever solution. Sometimes you just have to push the boulder. So the next time you're stuck in traffic or doing dishes for the 100th time this month, or working on something that feels pointless, remember Sisyphus, the king who fooled death 3 times, is still pushing his boulder right now, in this very moment, and he'll be pushing it long after we're all gone. The question is, are you pushing your boulder, or are you Sisyphus pushing his? Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more mythology content. Comment below, what's your Sisyphean task?